And what I would like for you to do is to think of your current workplace, or if you don't have a current workplace, think about this department. And I want you to write as many words down as possible that you think, so these would probably be adjectives, adverbs, nouns, if you remember your parts of speech, that would describe that workplace's culture. Because you all have been talking about organizational culture and professionalism. So what I would like you to think about is what words in your current workplace or in this department, whichever one you prefer talking about, how would you describe it in terms of the culture of the workplace? What words would you use? Could be this department again, if you'd rather not do your own workplace. Okay? So what are the words that you would use to describe that? I'm going to just be quiet a minute. So, okay, so you want some examples? Okay. In the film that you were supposed to have watched for today, the TED Talk, when I went through and watched it yesterday, I was writing down words. I actually watched it twice because it was so powerful in his use of language. And he talked about rescue, sacrifice for others, trust, cooperation, the circle of safety, providing opportunities, the heart is what counts, all suffer a little than having any suffer a lot. He also kind of contrasted that to danger, competition, frustration, protecting ourselves from each other, ambush, okay? He actually had a picture that had danger all the way on the outside and safety in the middle. So those are example of words. Of course, does that help? Okay. So example words that you could use to describe your workplace or this department. Come in. We're writing down words that we would use to describe. Words that we would use to describe your current workplace or our department. Adjectives, adverbs. What kind of words have you written down? Warm. Warm.
Positive.
Positive.
Close-knit.
Close-knit.
Organized. Stressful.
And what was that? Stress? Stressful? Stressed?
Stressful.
Stressful?
Community.
What other words do you have? Positive or negative?
Respectful.
Respectful?
Family.
Family?
Trustworthy.
Do these markers always make this kind of noise? Okay, good to know. What other words?
Laid back.
Focused.
Focused?
Honest. I have safety.
Safety?
Supportive.
You all either wrote about our department or you wrote about a really good workplace, because there's only one negative word up here, stressful. And that's,
Hostile.
huh?
Hostile.
Oh, okay, there we go.
I also have frustrated, overwhelmed, and tired. On the negative list.
All right, so those are words that describe culture, okay? You've been talking about how organizational culture influences professionalism, yes? Okay. What I want you to think about today is not just how organizational culture influences professionalism, but how professionalism influences organizational culture. So when I talk about it here, I'm going to make it into a, I thought maybe if I change colors it would be less squeaky, but obviously not.
you all have been talking about this part, organizational culture, how it influences professionalism. And I'm going to provide some examples today to talk about how professionalism influences organizational culture. Because sometimes what we are able to change in a culture, we come into a culture whenever we get ready to start a new job, or we get ready to do something, you come into this department. There are things that you can do to influence culture in an organization, culture in a group. And culture certainly influences the professionalism. Professionalism certainly influences the culture. So as I'm talking today, Ms. Johnston, Professor Johnston asked me to talk about my experiences in a compare and contrast way between my previous department that I was in as a workplace and the department that I'm in now in terms of organizational culture and professionalism. So I'm going to tell some stories, and I want you to think about what was the culture like based on the professionalism. And these are stories that happened in my previous department. I will not mention names, although I don't think anybody knows in Iowa. Some of them are no longer at the institution. But these were my impressions as I'm in this culture. And one of the reasons why I wasn't looking forward to going back into I loved teaching, but I was actually outside of my academic department when I applied for this job, doing some administrative work in the provost, vice president's office. And I knew that I was going to be going to teaching, and I wanted to go to the classroom, but what I didn't want to do is go to any meetings in my department because it was such a dysfunctional work environment, and the culture itself was not very good. All right, so I want you to think about what words you would use just from these examples to this particular culture that I was in. Okay, it was a communication department. So you would think at some levels that we would know how to communicate with each other, but that isn't always true. And again, this is not the current department. This is where I was before. I specifically remember one of the professors coming into me and telling me that he said he was really criticizing me for how I addressed an email. The email itself, whenever I'm addressing an email to multiple people, like faculty, I go through the list of the faculty that go to my head, the first ones first, okay? I don't necessarily think about them in a particular order. In this department, I actually go and visually think about where their offices are. So Dr. Tom Bray's almost always first in my emails, then Dr. Thompson, then it used to be Dr. Fuller. You can see where I'm going with then it was Dr. Driscoll, then it was Dr. Mirabel, and then I'd go down the hall. And I used to tell Dr. M, I'd apologize at the very beginning, I said, just because you're almost at the end of my list doesn't mean you're not important. And the reason why I said that is because of this story. I'll call this guy Dr. K. His last name did start with a K. He came into me one day, and he was huffing and puffing as he came in. I knew that something was wrong. And he said, you need to learn. I'm like, okay, what do I need to learn about? Not surprisingly from this person, because this person was also a person that in any given faculty meeting, and the faculty meetings had about 20 people in them, so it was a large group. He would pontificate about why he was right and why his program was best amongst all of our programs. So he came in one day and he said, you need to learn that full professors' names go first in the email. And whenever you're addressing an email to me and other people, my name should go first. I have been here the longest. I am the most senior professor. And so-and-so, who you put first in that email, absolutely should not be first. She's just an associate professor after all. I said, Dr. K, I appreciate your thoughts. I was seething inside. And probably said this a little bit more firmly than this. But I don't think about those things whenever I am doing an email. It literally is the first name that pops into my head. But I'll consider that in the future. Thank you. Anyway, that's one example. Another example was when I and a few other faculty members decided to stand up against promotion for one of my fellow faculty members. And we wrote a letter in
in support of the person not getting promoted. In the meeting that followed the letter of the minority letter, they called it minority letter because we were against the rest of the people in the group. One person, his name was Mr. H, sorry. Well, that's not what I called him, but anyway, his name was Mr. H, was calling that. He sat across the table and he said to me in particular, you, when you go up for promotion, will never be promoted based on what you did. I'm about in tears at that point in my, in the midst of sitting in front of all these people. I'm not that, probably had been in the faculty for 8 years maybe. I had been promoted once, but he was telling me I would never get promoted to the level that I was speaking against. As soon as we walked out of that meeting, we went into the workroom to get our mail, and he said to me, so what are your plans for the weekend? And I wanted to slap him. Okay. How can you be mean to me in one place and then be nice to me in another place? Another example from the culture of this organization, but also from the kind of communication that went on. When we were getting ready to have a new department chair in that department, and there were insiders and outsiders in this department. Ever been in a organizational culture in which there are insiders and outsiders? I prided myself in being able to straddle the fence. I could talk and be with the insiders, and I could talk and be with the outsiders. So when I was with the outsiders, they thought I was one of them. When I was with the insiders, they thought I was one of them. I was probably the only person that could have been, I think, 100% supported for department chair in that department. But I knew that if I was going to go into that department, that I was going to go into a den of snakes, where there are venomous vipers, where people behind each other's backs would talk. When as soon as a meeting was over, people would gather in each other's offices behind closed doors and talk about the other people. And not only talk about them behind closed doors, but when it came time to actually writing letters for recommendation or promotion, if that person's out of the room, they would cut them down one side and up the other. And if you said anything about and support of that person, you would be then cut one side down and up the other. There were people that had power over others, that thought they had power. Okay? And then there were people that didn't. Right? That was the culture in which I was going to go back into before I had this position that came advertised. How would you describe that culture? Which of the words on the board would you use?
Overwhelming.
Overwhelming.
Hostile.
Hostile.
I don't think toxic is up there, but
Very toxic.
Toxic. Okay. I had a department chair in that culture that actually was department chair for many, many years, and he stepped down to become dean, and which is a higher level than department chair. It's like the bosses for the department chairs. And he stepped down, and one of the things that he said that I found out later, he avoided conflict. And he said he would turn over a rock, and rather than deal with what was underneath that rock, he didn't know for sure if it was a landmine that was going to explode or not. So he learned to just leave the rocks not turned over. So he didn't deal with some of the issues. So very difficult situation. So one of my mentors said to me, do you want to go into that situation and lay your life down and sacrifice yourself for the good of this group? And that Simon Sinek TED Talk, is this one of your students?
Mm-mm.
In that TED Talk, he talked about a leader wanting to lay their lives down. In order to lay your lives down for something, you have to be committed to that something. I was committed to both sides, but I was going to lose friends by forcing them to talk to each other. I was no longer going to be able to be friends with them, potentially, because I was going to have to come down as a parent to say, this has got to stop. I could have done that, but I might have lost my family and my soul in the process. Maybe not my soul, but I might have lost my will to do what I'm doing in the process. So when you're thinking about going into an organization, you're thinking about analyzing the professionalism of the organization, you have to think about the little things like the examples that I gave, all those little pieces that go together that make it toxic. Did that organization start out toxic? Was it always toxic? I would argue that it wasn't. But were there things that happened that made it toxic? Absolutely. So professionalism is not just about seeing how the culture impacts, certainly the toxic environment impacts how they're communicating with each other, but how they're communicating with each other is impacting the culture. So here's the contrast. So I come in and observe see the job ad for this particular job. And I don't know anything about this department, but one of the things that I started doing was to look at their website. Now the website has changed a lot in the last few months with moving on to a different.
I think you turned the TV off.
Did I?
Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the things that I came across. Fostering the co-creation of better social worlds through positive communication. Now, positive communication there doesn't just mean that I'm being polite, that I'm being positive. It means that I'm doing things to build relationships. So when I came into the interview for this department, and actually when I met originally Dr. M, Dr. Mirabal, and Dr. McIntyre, two Dr. M's, were both at a conference that they invited me to come in so I could meet them and learn a little bit about their department. As they were talking about their department and bragging on who they were, one of the things that kept coming up, and it came up again in the interview, when I came in for the interview, was that we have disagreements with each other, but we work them out. And I'm like, okay, let's see if that's really true. Because that could be something that you can say. And since then, I've learned some of the dirty secrets, past things that have happened since I've been here. I didn't know that when I first came. And dirty, every culture, every company, every family has areas of dysfunction. There is not a perfect culture. Even the one that you were writing about with so many positive words, there are struggles. There are things that we have to work through. So the example was, and I've seen it actually happen, I've seen faculty, I won't call their names because you know them, actually go into another faculty member's office. But this time, rather than talking about a third faculty member, they're actually talking to each other about the potential disagreements that they just had in that meeting. I had led a retreat last, end of September, 1st of September, with our faculty. And there were disagreements. We were looking at our graduate program and how we might be able to rethink that, come up with new learning objectives, learning outcomes. And Dr. Driscoll and I had some disagreements, okay? And I have to be careful when I'm in those kind of settings to really to take off my department chair hat, because I want to be seen as collaborative. I don't want to be seen as I'm pushing my way, because I haven't been here very long. You all know the culture. I'm not going to come in and change the culture unless you want it changed, was my perception when I came in. And so I remember thinking afterwards, oh, I wonder if he was hurt by something I said in the meeting, and actually sending him an email and talking to him when we came back in the office on Monday. That's the kind of culture that we have here. That's a very different kind of culture. I found out that in my previous department, and partly it was because there were 20 people sitting in the room, we operated with parliamentary procedure. You guys ever run a meeting with parliamentary procedure? Robert's Rules of Orders. Okay, parliamentary procedure was typically done in order to get out of deadlock. when you were in deadlock over something, let's try to move forward. It wasn't intended to be a procedure that you use for every single decision that you make. But in my department, previous department, parliamentary procedure was used. And it was used to shut off discussion. Now, I don't know if they actually knew that. It was a very professional way of dealing with decision making. You make a motion, you have a second, you have discussion, and then you vote. That's basically the kind of the strategy for looking at using parliamentary procedure. But what often happens is that at some point someone calls the question. What does it mean if you call the question in parliamentary procedure? Anybody know it well enough to know?
Like when we were discussing, I just used to stay with the Clinton Library, they can, if someone, first of all, you're supposed to give permission, but they call point of order, that's what we talked about, they call a question, and then they're really baffling back and forth, is that what you?
Yeah. Calling the question stops the discussion. A person can call the question, and that means that you have to vote at that point, whether you're finished talking about it or not.
Because you're supposed to, when they make that motion, because I'm taking the minutes, and when they make that motion and second it, everything's supposed to be clear, but when they do that, then you got to start back over.
Right. So there are clear rules for how you follow. The rules for discussion are important if you've got a really intense conflict. It's kind of like mediation. I talk about the importance of, you guys have heard of the talking stick, the Native American custom, the talking stick? The reason why that's important is when it gets to be very intense. And the example that I give in classes sometimes is the nuclear reactors. You know, in Russellville there's a nuclear thing. I don't know all the physics terms for this because I didn't take physics in my general education. But anyway, in the nuclear reactors there are these control rods that are there all the time, or they're possibly there. The goal of a nuclear reactor is to make energy, okay? Why do they still have it in Russellville? It makes energy, electricity, okay, other things. But if it gets too hot, it melts down and it will destroy things around it, and it gets to be dangerous. Chernobyl in Russia was an example of that, much beyond most of your lifetimes before that. So they have these control rods that come down, and they come down only when the temperature in the actual nuclear reactor thingamajigger, yeah, that's a good one, gets too hot, okay? So when it gets too hot, then they come down and the atoms start hitting each other, hitting the control rods instead of each other. It cools things down, all right? They don't want it to stay too low of a temperature though, or it won't continue to do the electricity or whatever it's trying to power. So as soon as the temperature gets down, like a thermostat, at a certain level, they lift the control rods up. The control rods are like the talking stick in a relationship. The talking stick is when if I'm having a conflict with you, okay, and all of a sudden I realize I'm getting really uptight and intense about this, and I'm not really understanding, I'm just arguing, okay. So at that point, I need to just hear what you're having to say. So I give you, if I knew about the talking stick, I actually have a talking stick until my cats got rid of the fur on the end of it. I realized, so yeah, that was not a joy, but they thought it was. So I give you the talking stick and said, as long as it's your turn, then all I can do is reflect back what I hear you say. That's all I can do. I can't disagree with you. I can't say that's not fair, and all I reflect back until you tell me that, you know what, you understand me. And then it's my turn to share. Now, the more I can use I language and I feel this and good communication when I'm sharing, the less likely it is that you're going to react. But all you can do in the response back is to reflect back. Before I ever try to solve the problem, I need to have that kind of understanding, okay? But I don't need to do the talking stick if things are just kind of a little bit heated, but not really heated. I need the talking stick when the relationship is about to melt down. When I'm about to do something to make the climate toxic. The same thing is true of Robert's Rules of Order. You don't need Robert's Rules of Order unless you have a potentially toxic environment. Because it shuts down discussion. But everything that we did in that department was Robert's Rules of Order. Because we had some faculty members in the past that prided themselves in being expert parliamentarians. Mr. H was one of those people. Now, in this department, when I first came in, and we were just trying to decide some things related to curriculum with the undergraduate program, I said, so how do you all make decisions? And they said, well, we just talk it out till we come to consensus. I'm like, oh. Well, now it's easier to do when you have 10 people than when you have 20. I get that, okay? There are actually things that you can do in group discussions with 20 people to be able to come to consensus. If you've taken small group decision making or ever looked at the term called liberating structures. Anybody heard of liberating structures? Yes? Okay, no, since nobody's heard of it, I'm gonna pull it up here so you can see it. There's actually a really good site that if you're ever in a situation in which you are able to influence the way discussions are going, I don't remember if it's .com or if it is .org, so we'll find out here. Okay. .com, so no spaces, liberating structures, okay? When you feel included and engaged, do you do a better job? Do you think teams in which people work well together produce much better results? If yes, you found this kind of organization. And the thing that I really like about this is that there are actual things that you can do. All of these menu items are things that you can do in larger groups to help come to consensus without having to do parliamentary procedure or something like we were doing in our previous. So, for example, this one you actually have probably seen faculty use in classrooms, okay? So you ask a question, you have unlimited groups, but here's the thing that you do. Silent self-reflection. You think, you write down your ideas, then you get into pairs and actually create a common list between you. Then you get into foursomes and actually create a common list between you. And then you say, what's an idea that you share with the whole group that came out from all of you? So now everyone's voice is heard. Now in a group of 10 people, you don't necessarily need to do that. But in a group of 20, you might. Actually, in our retreat in which we had 8 people, I put people into groups of 4 in order for us to come up and brainstorm ideas, and then we shared with each other, saw what we had in common to try to come up with some possible learning outcomes for the graduate program. Because we haven't looked at that for a while. So, collaboration is an example of professionalism. Collaboration is also a term that can be used to describe an organizational culture. So when I learned that, I had to remember we don't need a motion, we don't need a second, we don't need discussion, we need to hear what everybody's thinking. But we have to create an environment in which that is allowed. So that if you say something that somebody else thinks is stupid, that is an idea that is way out there, that people don't just roll their eyes. Our department, my previous department, was so bad, they brought in communication consultants to help us. They gave us white handkerchiefs that we could throw, should have been yellow, football, foul, that we could throw when someone was violating rules. They set up communication rules for us because there were people that would hog the discussion. And so we could throw the flag down if they were taking too much time, if every other turn was taken by them in a group of 20 people. If people started rolling their eyes when that person started hogging the discussion, which is what would happen, then a flag could also be thrown. So that we became aware of the things that we were doing. That worked for the time that the consultants were there, and then we laughed about it and afterwards and never used it again. Now that's a little much, right? But what it does is it takes a leader to be able to see, here is what's going on in the situation. But the leader can't just come in and mandate. So what happened when we had a new department chair, and I decided that I wasn't going to run for the department chair position there, is the person came in, and his name was Dr. M. I know we have lots of M's and H's and stuff, but hey, his name was Dr. M. And he came in there, and during the interview he said, this is what I'm going to do with the department. I'm going to get rid of the divisions, and we're going to have units. What is the difference? He says, because I think divisions the word divisions creates a culture of divisions. I'm thinking to myself, units, divisions, we still have to have people, you know, whatever. But the people who were the outsiders, who hated him and his wife, who were both on faculty, they heard that to say, he is going to control the department. And from then on, he was their enemy. And they did everything they could to sabotage him. Toxic environment. But he came in with the way he presented it was, this is the way I'm going to do it. And it was. It's like a president coming in and saying, my first item of business is to send all the immigrants home, or whatever. My first item of, they don't ever typically do that first item of business first of all. But in this case, this department chair did that. And he came up, he did away with divisions. Did he ask for us to vote on it? Did he ask for us to think about it? Did he get opinions about it? He never asked me. I could have told him both sides, because remember, I was listening to both sides. Because one of my greatest strengths is harmonizing. And I can't stand conflict. Now that's a greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. If you can't stand conflict, then it's also very difficult for you to call someone out when they are not doing what they need to be doing. So, Ms. Johnston wanted me to introduce to you, and you may have already been familiar with this, a model that was developed in the 60s, actually it might have been before that, Stuart Gibbs, Defensive and Supportive Climates. Have any of you heard of that?
I've heard that name.
Okay. Well, first of all, let's go ahead and shut that off.